A racist cop smirked as he handcuffed a black man, convinced he had total control. But when the officer ran his ID, his hands started shaking. The man he just humiliated, the one person who could destroy his entire career, what happened next flipped the whole police department upside down. The flashing red and blue lights cast an eerie glow over the empty street, painting the night in chaos. Officer Bradley Monroe tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his knuckles whitening. His shift had been quiet. Too quiet. That's when he saw him. A black man walking alone. Bradley's lips curled into a smirk. Another one. Another suspicious man. Another arrest that would earn him praise from his equally prejudiced colleagues. He tapped the dashboard. Bingo. Without hesitation, he flicked on the siren. The black man, startled, turned his head. Confusion clouded his face for just a second before he pulled his hands from his pockets, already knowing what was about to happen. "Hands where I can see them," Bradley barked, stepping out of his squad car. The man raised his hands, his expression calm, almost bored. He had done this before. "What's the problem, officer?" Bradley hated that tone. The quiet confidence, the lack of fear. He wanted fear. He wanted to see this man squirm. "Problem is, you match the description of a robbery suspect," Bradley sneered, stepping closer. "I doubt that," the man replied, his voice even. Bradley didn't care. He was making this arrest whether the man liked it or not. With swift, practiced movements, he grabbed the man's wrists, slapping cold steel around them. The cuffs clicked into place. That's when the man did something that sent chills down Bradley's spine. He smiled. Not a nervous smile, not an apologetic one. A knowing smile. Bradley ignored the discomfort creeping up his spine. He shoved the man toward the squad car, pressing him roughly against the hood. "What's your name?" Bradley asked, pulling out his notepad. The man didn't answer right away. He glanced over his shoulder, meeting Bradley's eyes with an unsettling calmness. Then, he spoke. "You'll find out soon enough." Bradley's jaw tightened. He didn't like games. He yanked out the man's wallet and pulled out the ID. His eyes flicked to the name and his blood ran cold. The air in his lungs vanished. His hands trembled. His grip on the ID slackened, the laminated card slipping slightly between his fingers. Number, 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 number. This couldn't be happening. Bradley looked up at the man in horror. Because the person he had just humiliated, just handcuffed, just treated like a nobody, was the last person on earth he should have messed with. And in that moment, as realization dawned, Bradley knew one thing for sure. His entire life was about to be destroyed. Bradley's heart pounded against his ribs. He swallowed, but his throat felt like sandpaper. His eyes darted from the ID in his trembling hand back to the man standing before him, calm, composed, and far too powerful for Bradley's comfort. The man tilted his head slightly, amusement flickering in his sharp eyes. "Something wrong, officer?" Bradley's mind raced. This had to be a mistake, a trick, a sick joke. He forced himself to look down at the ID again, as if rereading the name would somehow change it. But it didn't. Elijah Carter. His stomach dropped. The name wasn't just familiar, it was legendary. Elijah Carter wasn't some random black man Bradley could shove into the system and forget about. He was one of the most powerful civil rights attorneys in the country. The same attorney who had taken down corrupt officers. The same man who had won multi-million-dollar lawsuits against police brutality. The man who had gotten racist cops fired, arrested, and humiliated on national television. And now, Bradley had just handcuffed him. His hands clenched into fists to stop their shaking. He needed to fix this. Fast. But before he could speak, Elijah shifted slightly, angling himself toward Bradley. "You've made a mistake," Elijah said, his voice low but steady. "A very big one." Bradley forced out a laugh, though it sounded strained. "Just following protocol." Elijah's eyes didn't waver. "Oh, is that why you threw me against the car without explanation?" Is that why you smirked while cuffing me? Protocol, huh? Bradley's pulse pounded in his ears. He could feel the shift in power. The same black man he had treated like nothing now had him cornered with just a few words. Elijah took a step closer, not aggressively, not threateningly, but with the confidence of a man who knew he was untouchable. You know, Elijah continued, voice calm but sharp, I've spent my entire career fighting men like you. Cops who abuse their badge. Officers who think a black man walking down the street is a crime. Bradley opened his mouth, but Elijah didn't give him the chance to speak. This is exactly why I do what I do, Elijah said, because if this is how you treat me, imagine what happens to the people who don't have my resources, the ones without power, the ones you really take advantage of. Bradley's palms were sweating. He stole a quick glance at his body cam, still recording. Every single second of this disaster was being captured. Elijah noticed. He smirked. That footage is going to be fun to review in court, he said. Bradley's stomach twisted into knots. His entire career, his reputation, his future. It was all hanging by a thread. He needed to think. Fast. Taking a deep breath, Bradley forced a strained smile. Listen, Mr. Carter, we can... Elijah lifted a brow. That's Attorney Carter to you. The words hit Bradley like a slap. The power dynamic had completely flipped. And for the first time in his life, Officer Bradley Monroe, the same man who had spent years getting away with racial profiling, felt exactly what it was like to be powerless. And Elijah Carter wasn't done with him yet. Bradley's mouth went dry. He had spent years bullying, profiling and brutalizing men who looked like Elijah Carter. But never, never had he been this close to real consequences. His mind scrambled for an escape, a way to undo the damage before it was too late. But deep down, he knew it was already too late. Elijah took another step forward, his presence suffocating. His hands were still cuffed, but somehow he was the one in control. Take these off, Elijah ordered. His voice wasn't raised, but it carried weight, the kind of authority that made people listen. Bradley hesitated. He was in too deep. If he unlocked the cuffs now, he would be admitting he had no reason to arrest Elijah in the first place. But if he didn't? Elijah's next words answered that for him. You leave these cuffs on a second longer, and I'll make sure the lawsuit that follows wipes out your entire department. Bradley felt like the air had been sucked from his lungs. He couldn't move, couldn't think. His entire body was screaming, fix this, now. Elijah sighed. I'm not asking again. Every instinct in Bradley's body told him not to obey, to fight for control. But the weight of the situation crushed his pride. His shaking hands reached for his key. He fumbled, nearly dropping it before finally unlocking the cuffs. The moment Elijah's wrists were free, he rolled them, stretching out his hands like a man who had just been released from prison. Bradley took a cautious step back. He had never felt this small. Elijah exhaled sharply, rubbing his wrists. His eyes, once calm, now burned with a quiet fury. You've been doing this for a long time, haven't you? Elijah asked. Stopping black men for no reason, abusing your badge, treating people like they don't matter. Bradley's lips parted, but no words came out. Elijah nodded slowly, as if he had already known the answer. You look nervous, officer. Something wrong? Bradley felt cornered. He had never been in this position before, on the defensive. Elijah's voice dropped lower, sharper. How many innocent men have you done this to? How many didn't get the chance to fight back? Bradley clenched his jaw. I was just doing my job. Elijah's laughter was cold, humorless. No, officer, your job is to serve and protect. What you did to me, that was a choice. Bradley looked around, hoping, praying for backup. But the street was empty. There was no one to pull him out of this mess, and Elijah knew it. You're lucky, Elijah continued. slipping his ID back into his wallet. "Lucky that I have options, that I have the power to expose you." He shook his head. "Because I know plenty of men who didn't get that chance. Men who ended up with their faces on the news, their names turned into hashtags." Bradley's pulse hammered. He could hear it in his ears, could feel the sweat dripping down his back. Elijah took a step closer, his voice a warning. "I could end your career tonight." Bradley's hands clenched at his sides. "Then why haven't you?" he snapped, desperate to regain some control. Elijah smirked. "Because watching you squirm, watching you feel exactly what it's like to have your power stripped away." He leaned in, lowering his voice to a whisper. "That's more satisfying than any courtroom." Bradley froze. For the first time in his life, he felt exactly what it was like to be powerless. And the worst part, Elijah Carter was just getting started. Bradley could feel his entire world closing in. His body was still, but his mind was spinning, racing for a way out, for some way to turn this around. But there wasn't one, not this time. Elijah stood before him, completely unfazed, rubbing his wrists where the cold metal cuffs had bitten into his skin. The power shift was suffocating. Bradley wasn't the one controlling the situation anymore, and he knew it. "You look scared, officer." Elijah's voice was measured, but there was something undeniably sharp beneath the surface. "Now you know how every black man you've ever harassed has felt." Bradley's jaw tightened. "Look, Carter." "Attorney Carter," Elijah corrected without hesitation. The words landed like a slap. Bradley had spent years sneering at men like Elijah, talking down to them, belittling them. Now, the respect was being demanded, and there wasn't a damn thing he could do about it. "I didn't—" Bradley stopped himself. What was he going to say? That he didn't mean to racially profile Elijah? That he hadn't been enjoying it up until he saw the ID? Elijah took a deep breath, shaking his head. "You really thought you were untouchable, huh?" He studied Bradley for a long, excruciating moment. "But tell me something, officer. What do you think happens now?" Bradley's stomach twisted. He knew exactly what could happen. The body cam footage, it was still rolling. It had captured everything. The condescending smirk, the unnecessary aggression, the smugness in Bradley's voice when he first cuffed Elijah. And then the instant shift when he realized who he had just arrested. Bradley's hands balled into fists. His career wasn't just on the line. His entire life was hanging by a thread. "Maybe I should do what you do," Elijah said, tapping his chin. "Maybe I should call some friends, call the media, make sure this whole incident gets the attention it deserves." Bradley's heart slammed against his ribs. The media. He pictured his face plastered across every news station. "Racist cop arrests civil rights attorney in baseless stop." He pictured protesters outside his precinct, his name being chanted in outrage, his boss throwing him under the bus to save the department's reputation. He could already hear the statement, "Officer Monroe's actions do not reflect the values of this department." And then, the phone call from Internal Affairs, the investigation, the unpaid suspension, the desperate scramble to save his job, while people like Elijah Carter watched with satisfaction as his world burned to the ground. Number. He had spent years getting away with this. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. Bradley snapped. "You don't know me," he hissed, voice low, defensive. "You think you're some kind of hero, but you don't know a damn thing about me." Elijah didn't flinch. If anything, he looked amused. "Oh, I know exactly who you are," he said. "You're the cop who thought he had all the power. The one who assumed a black man walking down the street was guilty of something." He tilted his head. "And now?" "Now you're just another scared man with a badge, finally realizing it doesn't make you invincible." Bradley's breathing was uneven. His fists clenched and unclenched at his sides. He felt cornered, like a wild animal lashing out before the inevitable. Elijah took a step back, shaking his head. "You're not worth my time," he said simply. "But don't think for a second this is over." And then, without another word, he turned and walked away. Bradley just stood there, frozen, humiliated, and for the first time in his life, terrified. Bradley stood rooted to the pavement, his pulse hammering in his ears as he watched Elijah walk away, free, powerful, and completely in control. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had been the one in charge, the one calling the shots. But now he was the one being judged. His body cam was still on, still recording. For the first time, he wished it wasn't. A sick feeling churned in his stomach as he yanked it off his vest, staring at the tiny, blinking red light. This footage would ruin him. His mind screamed at him. Delete it. Get rid of the evidence. He had done it before. It wasn't hard. A technical malfunction. A corrupt file. He could fix this. But this time was different. Because Elijah Carter wasn't just some random black man with no resources. Elijah Carter was the kind of man who knew exactly how the system worked. He had handled cases just like this before, probably hundreds of them. If Bradley deleted the footage, Elijah would know. And if he knew, Bradley would go from under investigation to behind bars. His fingers twitched over the device, his mind at war with itself. Then the sound of footsteps rushed toward him. "Monroe, what the hell happened?" Bradley turned sharply, his heart jumping into his throat. Officer Darren Phillips, his partner, was jogging toward him, a deep frown cutting across his face. Bradley had never been so relieved to see him. Phillips glanced around, confused. "Where's the suspect?" Bradley swallowed hard. He wasn't a suspect. His voice felt foreign, like it belonged to someone else. It was a mistake. Phillips's frown deepened. He looked down at the body cam in Bradley's hands. "You still rolling?" Bradley hesitated. His grip on the camera tightened. "Yeah." Phillips exhaled sharply. "Damn, what a mess." He ran a hand over his face. "Look, just say the guy matched a description. Say he got aggressive. You know the drill." Bradley's mouth went dry. "The drill. Lieutenant. Cover it up. Make it go away." It was exactly what he had done dozens of times before, and for years it had worked. But now Elijah Carter was involved, and Elijah Carter wasn't going away. Bradley shook his head. "No, we can't spin this." His voice was quieter now, weaker. Phillips's eyebrows shot up. "What?" Bradley exhaled, his shoulders sagging. "It was a bad stop," he admitted, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. "He wasn't the guy. He's a civil rights attorney." Silence. Then Phillips laughed, a short, humorless bark. "Oh, you are so screwed." Bradley didn't respond. He didn't need to, because deep down he already knew. Elijah Carter had left the scene, but the damage had already been done. The fall had already begun, and there was nothing Bradley Monroe could do to stop it. The next morning, Officer Bradley Monroe walked into the precinct, feeling like a man on death row. The station was louder than usual, phones ringing, officers murmuring, keyboards clacking. But there was something else in the air. A shift. A tension that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, his stomach twisted. They knew. He could see it in their glances, the way conversation stuttered to a stop as he walked by. Then, the captain's door swung open. "Monroe, in my office, now." Bradley's breath caught in his throat. He forced himself to move, his boots feeling like cement blocks as he stepped into the office. Captain Ruiz stood behind his desk, arms crossed, seething. On the desk, a laptop was open, and on the screen, the body cam footage. Bradley's mouth went dry. Elijah's face filled the screen. His calm, unwavering voice played through the tinny speakers. "This is exactly why I do what I do." Then Bradley's own voice, smug, condescending, undeniable. Problem is, you match the description of a robbery suspect. The captain slammed the laptop shut. Do you have any idea what you've done? Bradley swallowed. He didn't answer. He couldn't. Ruiz ran a hand over his face. This footage, it's already outside the department. His voice was tight, barely controlled. Elijah Carter's team sent it to the press this morning. Bradley's stomach dropped. The media is eating it up. Ruiz's voice was rising. Civil rights attorney unlawfully detained? Racial profiling on full display? He scoffed. Do you have any idea what this means for us? Bradley felt sick. He could already imagine it. His name trending, his face on every news channel, reporters digging into his past. How many other unlawful stops had he made? How many complaints had been brushed under the rug? It was all about to come out. Ruiz exhaled, pinching the bridge of his nose. When he spoke again, his voice was final. You're being placed on administrative leave, effective immediately. The words hit like a truck. Bradley lurched forward. Captain, please. It's not up for debate. Ruiz's eyes were cold. You're done. Bradley opened his mouth, desperate to say something, anything. But then a new sound filled the office. His phone vibrating. He pulled it from his pocket and his blood ran cold. Unknown number. A message popped up on the screen. Hope you're ready for what's next. EC. Bradley's hands began to shake, because he knew this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. Bradley sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The precinct behind him felt like a crime scene, his crime scene. His career was over. The media had the footage. The department had turned its back on him. The world was watching. And Elijah Carter. Elijah Carter was just getting started. Bradley's phone buzzed again. Another message. Turn on the news. ECA chill ran down his spine. His fingers trembled as he unlocked his phone, pulling up the live broadcast. There he was, Elijah Carter, standing in front of a podium, cameras flashing, reporters hanging on to his every word. What happened to me last night was not an accident, Elijah said, his voice calm yet powerful. It was a deliberate act of racial profiling, something black men in this country experience every single day. Bradley's chest tightened. But here's the difference, Elijah continued. I have the resources to fight back. And trust me, I will. The crowd erupted. Reporters shouted over each other, cameras zooming in. The image of Elijah standing tall, powerful, untouchable, was now seared into history. Officer Monroe thought he could humiliate me. But what he didn't realize is that he handcuffed the wrong black man. And now... Elijah looked straight into the camera. Now, he's going to pay for it. The broadcast cut to the news anchor. Breaking tonight, civil rights attorney Elijah Carter has officially filed a lawsuit against Officer Bradley Monroe and the entire police department. Bradley stopped listening. His heart plummeted. This wasn't just a suspension. This wasn't just bad press. This was the end. A lawsuit meant everything would come out. Every traffic stop, every excessive force complaint, every time he had laughed about roughing up a suspect. And the media, they'd dig up everything. Bradley felt it happening in real time. His phone buzzed with news alerts. Social media was on fire. His name was everywhere. Officer Bradley Monroe, the face of racial profiling. Corrupt cop exposed on camera, Elijah Carter strikes back. How many others has he done this to? His blood turned to ice. His so-called friends, silent. His fellow officers, nowhere to be found. Bradley had spent years thinking he was untouchable, that he could get away with anything, that the system would always protect him. But now he was watching his entire life burn to the ground, and Elijah Carter was the one holding the match. For the first time in his life, Bradley Monroe knew exactly what it felt like to be powerless, and he couldn't do a damn thing about it. Bradley Monroe sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, the glow of the television flickering across his pale face. The news anchors were still talking about him, his name now synonymous with disgrace. Former Officer Bradley Monroe officially fired amid civil rights lawsuit. Elijah Carter vows to ensure justice for victims of racial profiling. This is more than one bad cop. This is a systemic problem. The words cut deeper than any wound. Former officer. It was official now. He was done. It had happened fast. The lawsuit had put pressure on the department, and in a desperate attempt to save their own reputation, they sacrificed him. Officer Monroe's actions do not reflect the values of this department. Bradley laughed bitterly. He had spent years doing exactly what the department had allowed him to do, what they had trained him to do. But now that the world was watching, they threw him away like trash. His phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. He already knew who it was. With shaky hands, he answered. Elijah. His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. There was a long silence on the other end. Then, I told you this wasn't over. Bradley closed his eyes, his head falling into his hands. What do you want? His voice wasn't angry anymore. It wasn't defensive. It was just defeated. I want you to understand, Elijah said. His voice was calm, but there was something in it, something unshakable. For years, you held power over people who couldn't fight back. You thought your badge made you untouchable. Bradley said nothing. What could he say? Elijah continued. But today, you felt what it's like to be powerless. And trust me, it won't be the last time. Bradley swallowed hard. His hands clenched into fists, but not out of anger, out of fear. You're going to face consequences, Bradley, Elijah said. Not just from me, from the system, from the people you hurt. Your time of walking away untouched is over. Bradley's breathing was unsteady. His chest felt tight. What do you want me to do? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elijah let out a slow breath. I don't want anything from you, but I do want you to remember this feeling, because this is justice. Click. The line went dead. Bradley slowly lowered the phone, his fingers trembling. Outside, the world kept moving. The news kept playing. The lawsuits continued. The outrage grew. And him? He was nothing now. He had spent years controlling others. But now, for the first time in his life, someone else had taken complete control of him, and there was no escape.